Okay, first off, understanding is part of our democratic right and duty. But if data is not forthcoming, if research that asks questions researchers know to be important to ask is not conducted, if research findings are not shared outside of closed-door sessions, if analyses are not widely shared and circulated in various media outside of small academic audiences, then people cannot exercise these rights or duties. Beyond knowing how to read and critically evaluate data, readers also need to understand that this is where our knowledge production system is at. To understand our world in such a context, we need to actively, hungrily seek out varied sources and to read them skeptically and cautiously. So today I'm going to be talking about this book, and this is what Inequality looks like. It's a collection of 10 essays thereabouts by a professor in NUS called T.I.W.I.L.L. She teaches sociology, and my brother bought this for me a while ago for Christmas. That's why it's the old edition with the tracing paper cover. It took me a while to get to it because I wanted to make sure that I would be able to read it in one go. So I didn't read anything in between. I just focused on reading this, and I managed to do it in about 10 days. I started with this passage, which is on page 289 of this book, because I felt that that encapsulated my motivations behind wanting to read this book in the first place. It's a bit battered now because I took a long time reading it, so I brought it everywhere. I read it on the train, I read it on the bus, I read it when I was waiting for my food, and there's a lot to talk about, but I think for the purposes of my wrap-up of this book, I would just focus on 5 aspects. So the first would be a discussion of what we are actually doing when we blame individuals for systemic failings. Also, what are we doing when we compare their suffering with ours. It also brings up the gendered dimension, so that's a third thing. She also spends a sizable amount of time in the center talking about parents and their relationship with their schooling children, especially parents that do not receive the amount of support that they should be receiving. And lastly, the concept of dignity and needs. Okay, so to start off, she says on page 19, to study poverty without inequality leads to tendencies to misrecognize structural issues for individual failings. On page 34, inequality in fact is a logical outcome of meritocracy. It renders those who succeed through the system as legitimately deserving. Left implicit is that those at the bottom have failed to be deserving. This is like one of my favorite pages, page 224. I underlined it and then I starred and then I wrote "Go off, sis," because she snapped. She's talking about people who insist on shifting the conversation to those who are just unmotivated to help themselves. People have come up to her saying that she's assigning too much blame to the system and not granting agency to the low income. They want to know what can we do to help empower the low income so that they can help themselves. And she says, the problem with this mindset, not of those who are powerless, but those who are relatively powerful, is that power is not a frame of mind but a material condition. People sitting in positions of authority are powerful not because they feel empowered, but because they have power. Their feelings of empowerment are an outcome of their actual ownership of power and not the cause. No amount of merely changing how they think about themselves will change these realities. The invocation of motivation, of mindsets, of agency, they are powerful distractions from looking at poverty as linked to inequality. They are bait and switch moves to avoid acknowledging poverty as that which is reproduced within a system. So there was a few excerpts from that particular theme. Moving on to the second theme of comparing people's current suffering with our past suffering. She says that some people, old people, have come up to her and they said, oh, cold showers are not a big deal. I took cold showers a lot when I was younger. Singapore is so hot. A cold shower is great. And then they also talk about how in the past hygiene standards weren't so great. There were also bed bugs in their bed, so what was the big deal? T.I.W.I.L.L writes that the remarks were made partly in jest, but their speakers aimed to soften the impact of my claims. Towards the end, again, on page 235, she says that the reason why people react that way is because stories of poverty, even in today, bother them. She says that they are troubling. Stories about people living in 2017 Singapore inhabiting what sounds more like their 1965 Singapore are stories that are troubling. They challenge the coherence of their stories, they disturb the moral goodness of their trajectories, they raise questions about their deservedness. She felt that part of what effect they were trying to achieve was to reduce the weight of her findings and trivialize the hardships of her respondents. This section is called Hitting a Nerve. The third thing that I found personally interesting was how she talked about heteronormativity in Singapore and how it's necessary for survival. She writes, meeting needs depends on a combination of regular employment and stable marriages where men and women play gendered roles. How well the needs are met and how securely they can be met in the long term depends further on income sufficient for savings and on investments, as well as maintaining interdependent economic relationships within families. And even if you need subsidies for anything, these are dependent on rigid familial forms. Being and staying married are preconditions to accessing public goods, most notably housing. She says that there is a gendered division of labor, which is supported and reproduced by multiple policies, and in fact unmarried women and their children still cannot form what is called the family nucleus that is required to apply for public housing, which makes no sense to me. So she says heteronormativity encompassing specific performances of both gender and sexuality remains strongly affirmed through state institutions and practice. In various policies around public housing, childcare, work benefits, mothers continue to be distinguished from fathers, unmarried mothers from married ones, married couples from unmarried persons. So the main point of what she's saying is that even though so many years have passed, policies have not changed enough to genuinely disrupt this principle of differentiated deservedness. This is on page 182. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is how she mentions that parents' backgrounds play an extremely important role in their children's futures. She says that it's very difficult to fault parents for wanting the best for their children, but it's important to notice that this type of campaigning is not class neutral. It comes more easily to people who have themselves succeeded in the system and understand its logic. And then she cites a sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who says that parents from higher class backgrounds subtly transmit advantages to their children through socializing them in ways of speaking, relating to authority figures, and understanding things like art and music. So these are called cultural capital. They are qualities that schools reward and yet do not teach. They are capital because they eventually translate into formal credentials and also into legitimate status. This legitimacy is possible because the relative advantages and disadvantages of kids and the hidden requirements of schools are not apparent. So because these hidden requirements are not obvious, most people will see the rules of the game as fair. So if you do well in school, you deserve it, you studied hard or something like that. More importantly, the people who do make it to the top of the social hierarchy, they climb the ladder of formal education, they are seen both by themselves and by those below them as meritorious and deserving. What she's saying then is that in Singapore, when you have economic capital, you transform it into cultural capital in your children, who are then able to transform it back into economic capital in the future. She also endorses schools trying to even out the playing field a little bit. She expresses disapproval towards how some kids, when they go to primary school, they're already expected to read and write and everything, even though they are supposed to start from ground zero. And then because they're being compared to those who have had advantages, in their early childhood, that most of the kids who appear to be lagging behind are actually neurotypical. It's not that they have learning disabilities, it's just that because they have not had the same amount of exposure, but but given a bit more time, they can actually catch up and prove themselves as, you know, capable. And the main reason they fall behind ultimately is traced back to their relative class disadvantage. And she writes here on page 125, kids who have insufficient exposure outside of school should have sufficient exposure within it and sufficient time to even out the advantages and disadvantages resulting from class differences. On this, I actually agree. On page 147, wealth and social status matter a lot in this city. Everyone in Singapore knows this. You can see it in the body language of people interacting as customers and waitstaff at restaurants. You can see it in the bodies of people brushing past each other in public spaces. You hear it in the voices of people speaking to people higher and lower than themselves. We are an extremely status-conscious society where there are people who serve and people who are served, and people are expected to manage their bodies to adjust their tones accordingly. Parenting while low income is about parenting with the knowledge that one has low status in this society. And so low income parents find themselves having to do this immensely difficult thing. They have to tell their kids to listen to them and yet also send them the message, don't be like me. It is difficult to exercise authority under these conditions. To have one's parenting practices be unintelligible, unacknowledged, deemed less worthy is a profound form of attack on the self, especially when being a parent is a central part of one's identity. The last thing that I found interesting was her discussion of needs, wants, and dignity. That's the name of the chapter. So on page 194, she says, what we frequently think of as wants in specific contexts are needs. They are, as the sociologist Alison Perk's work shows, dignity needs. They allow us to feel like we belong to the groups we care about, that we are rooted in, and that we need respect, acceptance, and... Yes? Okay, ignore my cat. And that we need respect, acceptance, and love from. So, as the title of Perk's book suggests, we long for things because we long to belong. It often includes things that appear useless in the eyes of adults like fidget spinners, Pokemon cards, and slime. However, parents want to fulfill these desires. To be able to please our children, to make them joyous however fleeting, is an important part of being a good parent. Low-income parents cannot and do not expect to fulfill all their desires, but they recognize how important these things are to their children. And related to this is how parents in low-income families, even though there is this idea that there are many avenues of help for people in low-income families, for parents who can get, like, you know, pocket money for their children to eat at recess, it's actually not enough, and in fact the process is extremely debasing and not at all worth the pittance that they receive. So she writes on page 212, to qualify for a small sum of money, people have to subject themselves to sustained scrutiny and discipline. Instead of framing this degree of deprivation as deeply problematic, the focus is on people who have such needs and on their performing deservedness for this tiny amount of aid. In this case, the institutions set up to help have embedded within their institutional logic a high tolerance for the suffering and struggle of people known to the system to be struggling at this level. In other words, these are not the proverbial fallen through the cracks people. These are people that the system knows are in such bad condition that they are willing to answer all kinds of personal questions about their families just so that their kids can eat at recess. This example illustrates a larger dynamic in Singapore's system of carefully calibrated conditional aid. One has to be desperate before one has access to anything at all, and even then, that suffering is repeatedly tolerated when aid is withheld, suspended, and finally taken away. When I was reading it, I actually felt like guilty, and I think that it's okay. You know, I don't blame this book for making me feel guilty. In fact, I think that everyone should read this book and feel guilty, because I feel like I lived so many years in this country and I was so unaware I think we were all a little bit aware of it. You know, in social studies lesson, they made you talk about the Gini coefficient, the difference between inequality and inequity, and then you keep talking about, oh, what can we do to, you know, lessen the inequity gap. But at the end of the day, nothing is done. There is no follow-up, and then you move on to higher education, and then you don't think about it anymore, and then you just focused on surviving, completely forgetting that there are people out there who are also focused on surviving, but they do not have the luxuries and the privileges that you are afforded simply by being born in the right place and in the right time to the right pair of parents. I think like what this book also brings out is that it's very easy to blame the parents and be like, you didn't discipline your child, or like, why is your child falling behind in class, you never help him with his homework, is it? But it's not so easy and it's not so straightforward. And because the method that this writer uses is ethnography, so she uses empirical data. The whole point of ethnography is to interview people on the ground, you know, people living on the land, and then you go there and then you really find out, and then instead of thinking about like big data, you focus on maybe 10 people. I hope I'm not ruining what ethnography is, but it kind of is. It's like you kind of go deep, not wide. There's really a lot to think about and a lot to talk about beyond the excerpts that I have chosen that specifically spoke to me. Overall, I think I'm just really disturbed by the lack of awareness. You know, judging by what she wrote about the responses that people sent to her, they wrote letters and they wrote emails to her, judging by what those people said, I think that it is a rather common response to feel, on one hand, gratitude towards this writer for really making something academic so accessible and so personal, but at the same time also this guilt, you know, that we as a society have not done enough. In fact, what have we done? Probably nothing. So this is my mid-June check-in. I am alive, barely. I'm not getting enough sleep. I am not feeling my best, but I have been trying to read consistently. So this month so far, I have read this book, I have read this book, but I'll talk about this in my next video because I don't have time for this video. I'm partway through Woman Warrior, and I have read books 1, 2 and 5 of Princess Diaries. I'm rereading books from my childhood. So okay, that's it from me today. Hopefully I will be alive enough to check in again at the end of January, or maybe the first week of February. Say bye bye.